There we go. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Kitty. Many of you know me. I'm an organizer here with DXC in the Bay Area. I do a lot of the community stuff. And now I also do consent trainings. So today we're going to be talking about consent. We're going to talk about what consent is not, what sexual assault is, how to support survivors of sexual assault, how to normalize consent in our community, and also just in our lives. And also, before we get started, I just, oops, I just want to mention that we're going to be talking about topics that can bring up a lot of emotions and feelings. It can be super sensitive. People might have trauma around these issues. So, if at any point you need to leave and take space to process things or just kind of like check out, turn off your video, etc., that's totally fine. Just take the time and space that you need. And also, before jumping into everything, I also just want to start with the resources. So, yeah, please take a screenshot if you need to. If you or someone that you know is ever the victim of sexual assault or rape, you can seek support and help from these various sources. There's obviously more sources that I'm not super aware of. Obviously, reaching out to friends and loved ones. There's locally in the Bay Area, Women Against Rape. They have a hotline phone number on their website. There's the National Sexual Assault Hotline. Um, and yeah, and if it's within DXC, obviously that's something that DXC organizers need to know about so that we can remove perpetrators from the community. So, and then, I wanted to also start with this short video. Let's see.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, fuck yes, I would fucking love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week." Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, "But you wanted tea last night." But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Okay, so some of y'all may have seen that video before. Ignore the questions right now. We'll get to that. I like it because it's super straightforward. And it's super simple. Consent really just comes down to basic respect, and placing dignity and respect of other people over our own personal desires. And so, yeah, in the chat, part of the reason that we do this training is because consent is not something that we're often taught about in school or even by our own parents. So I just wanted to start with some questions. People can post them in the group chat. They're posted right here. In high school, did you receive any sort of sex education, or even in middle school? Do you remember anything from those sex education classes? And do you remember if your sex education ever mentioned sexual assault or consent at all? Brian said sex education in seventh grade, very little about consent, mostly like no is no. Leaf said, yes, there was talk about safe sex, but not consent. Mona says, I remember sex ed classes, but it was focused on consensual sex. Orlando says, very little sex ed, abstinence based, nothing about consent. Pretty basic puberty class in sixth grade, sex education, middle school, don't remember anything about consent. Michelle didn't at school, but with her family, yes. Um, so yeah, it's. I just wanted to bring that up and invite people to reflect on that, just because consent is such an important part of human relationships, in our friendships, in our work relationships, in our romantic relationships, like every relationship. And it's just shocking to me that it's not something that we're taught about much at all. And we're actually taught a whole lot of the opposite. We're taught a ton of anti consent behaviors all around us, from the media and even people around us that behave in ways that are anti consensual. Um, and before, I used to think about consent and respect and bodily autonomy, before I really thought about those things seriously, I didn't really notice the sexism and anti consent behavior and sexual violence that's all around us. Like, think about music lyrics that we hear in popular songs that talk about doing things to women or to other people without their consent, or using them as sexual objects or objects to demonstrate their social status or power and all those things. Like, it's so easy to not really think critically about those things, but it's really everywhere around us. The more you pay attention, the more you see it. And then think of like all the movie plots and TV show plots in which um, people are used for just sexual purposes, or women, for example. It's a really common that I see, like a woman will reject a man repeatedly. He continues to woo her or pressure her, and eventually he wins and he gets to sleep with her, whatever it is that he wanted to do. And that's really, really common. I actually see it in a ton of movies. I never noticed it before, but now I see it. I'm not sure if y'all have noticed it, but that's completely anti-consensual, and it teaches and rewards anti-consensual behavior, and it teaches this concept, like you maybe saw on the cover of the event page, that no means convince me, right? And that's really not cool and really messed up, and totally feeds into the rape culture that we live in. um, and there are even worse movie plots and TV show plots where perpetrators are totally glorified and rewarded, and victims are blamed for various reasons. Another example is the porn industry, and this is partly because we're not taught about proper sex education and about consent. A lot of people I know, at least my peers growing up, like, learn a lot about sex ed, get their sex ed from porn. And I'm not saying porn is inherently bad or evil. It's just that that's not how we should be learning about our sexuality and how to be intimate with others, because porn, for the most part, doesn't really demonstrate what consent looks like. For example, you'll never see in mainstream porn people asking each other before they do something or checking in with people. Um, and there are many kinds of porn, but sadly, the most common in the vast majority of porn is pretty terrifying, because it depicts a whole lot of violence and abuse, and there's often simulated or actual rape that happens in a lot of porn videos. So I just wanted to point that out too. since that has a huge influence on people's ideas of sex and intimacy. And our ignorance around consent isn't necessarily our fault as individuals, because we've grown up in a society and in a world really that's super messed up in a lot of ways. And as a result, we absorb the not so good parts of our society, including racism and speciesism and sexism and all these other forms of discrimination that inherently we are taught and we absorb. So the patriarchal, sexist, and anti-consent culture that we grow up in is constantly showing us people disrespecting each other, violating each other's consent. So naturally, that's what we're learning. And that's why it's so important that we interrupt those harmful ideas and actively discuss and get uncomfortable and unlearn and relearn how to respect each other's bodily autonomy and consent. So I want to talk about what consent actually is. Consent is agreeing to and wanting to do something with someone else, and it's required 100% of the time in all intimate and sexual encounters and with all partners. Consent is also mutual. It's something that you give, but also something that you receive. And consent isn't like a checklist of things that you have to check off to be able to sleep with someone or do whatever you want with them sexually. It's truly and fully respecting someone's boundaries and respecting them as a human being, and not just having a specific sexual motive that you're trying to achieve. Consent is also an invitation to speak up, and it's also about listening to what others are okay with and not okay with, and accepting no when people do say no. And the opposite of consent is sexual assault. Um, so people can respond in the chat again. What does consent look like to you? And how would you know that someone is giving consent? And how do you express consent? Yeah, and people can post in the chat. Ben says affirmative verbal consent. All right, I don't know if maybe there's a delay, but I'll move on and I'll keep reading them if more pop up. Oh, Dave says a wide smile with verbal consent. Ben says like hell yes, not I guess, which is totally true, and it also rhymes. Um, so some examples of what consent can look like include that they've clearly communicated interest. There's a clearly given yes, not the absence of a no, like Ben mentioned, not an I guess. There's no coercion involved at all, be it physical or emotional or blackmail or anything like that. Um, both people are fully conscious and aware of what they're agreeing to, and there's no substances that are preventing them from making fully informed choices. They're awake, they're not drunk, they're free to act, move away, have sex, or not have sex, or do whatever they want. They're not being restricted. They verbally said yes, but also their body language says yes. They show that they know what they're consenting to, and they want to participate in it. Like, I forgot who mentioned in the chat, but oh, like Dave said, like a wide smile. Like maybe they're smiling, maybe they're touching back, maybe they're making eye contact, taking initiative. Those are verbal or physical cues too that someone's consenting. So maybe someone could say yes, but if they're stiff and look scared and aren't moving, they're probably not really honestly consenting. Um, and then consent is also reversible. So you could be kissing someone or having sex with someone, and the other person, you and the other person, have every right to stop if you ever feel uncomfortable, change your mind, and just do something else. And no one has a right to force you to continue if you've changed your mind. And then consenting to a sexual activity, it means that you're willing to participate, and it means that you're free to choose what you want to do without being pressured or forced to. It's not simply um, saying no or maybe, but it's a super solid yes. It applies to all aspects of our relationships, not just sex and intimacy. Although violating someone's consent in a sexual encounter is a lot more traumatic and serious, we should also be aware of other ways that we can and should respect people's consent. For example, when we go to hug somebody, if we want to hug someone, especially someone we don't know super well, we should ask them if they want to hug. And most of us have hugged people without asking, and most of us have been hugged without being asked, and it's generally not super traumatic or serious. But we do need to normalize consent, even in the smallest interactions, including hugs. And I can think of several awkward hugs that I've been given that I didn't really want, and even hugs that felt creepy to me that I would have liked to avoid. And I'm sure I've hugged people that didn't want to be hugged. Um, and I don't want to make people feel that way. So I make a strong effort, and I encourage everybody to just ask for consent when hugging and make it clear at all times that we care about and respect people's boundaries. And another example is like even talking to people. Like has anyone ever just started talking to you, pulled you into like a monologue or a long story? Maybe you don't even really know this person super well, but it feels like they feel entitled to your time and your energy, and maybe you want to be doing something else. I'm sure this happens a lot more to women, but just like hugging, many of us have talked to people who probably didn't want to talk to us, and vice versa. But I think that we can and should normalize simply asking things like, hey, I had a really rough day. Can I talk to you about it? Or can I tell you a story? Before we force someone into a conversation. And I also wanted to talk about boundaries. Obviously, it's super important to discuss consent with your partner or partners, but it's also really helpful to take time by yourself to think about where your boundaries lie, what you are and are not comfortable with, how to communicate your boundaries and feelings. Um, if we have grown up learning about sex and intimacy from movies, porn, people around us, we may have a sense of like, quote, what sex is supposed to look like and what we're supposed to want. Um, but we rarely are invited to ask ourselves and reflect on our own what we actually want and what we don't want. For example, I was taught from just the things around me that I had always seen that women are supposed to want to be choked, and hit, and spanked, and all of these things. And so I believe that, like, okay, that's what I'm supposed to accept, and that's what women are supposed to want. Um, but then I was honest with myself, and it wasn't easy to reflect and be like, hey, like, why do I feel this way? Why do I get triggered? And it's like, oh, I hate the feeling of anything touching my throat, like even a necklace. Like, I don't like it at all. But it took me taking time also to see where my boundaries lie, to be able to even realize that and communicate that to partners and other people. So I know that there are situations in the past, not just for myself, I'm sure for other people on the call too, where I would have felt more empowered to leave or been more empowered to communicate what I didn't want, and what I wanted if I had asked myself and given myself control over where my boundaries are. Additionally, I know that often I've let things happen to me, and I've heard many women have similar experiences of they've let things happen to them that they really didn't want to happen because they didn't want to hurt someone's feelings and didn't want to cause drama or whatever. But I really want to empower everyone to be selfish when it comes to your intimate boundaries and your well-being. um, and yeah, your consent and well-being is more important than someone else's horny feelings anytime, any day. um, yeah, and then moving on to the opposite of consent. How might someone express that they're not consenting to something, and how have you expressed that you don't consent to something? You guys can share in the chat. Oh, I see a bunch more about people expressing consent. Ali had said, it's important to ensure that there is equal power dynamics in the interaction and relationship without any fear of intimidation. Consent needs to be checked in on throughout the interaction through consistent communication. Absolutely. Yeah, and while I wait for people to give comments on what not consenting looks like, um, just to emphasize how important communication is, I think we're taught that sex is supposed to be spontaneous and talking kills the mood or all of these things. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. Like, so many problems could be avoided if we just communicated with each other and respected each other rather than trying to have spontaneous sex or whatever we're taught in movies and porn and stuff. Like, none of that's realistic. What is really important is checking in on people and communicating with them. And for how people express that they don't consent, Matthew Dembski says hesitation or reservation. I try to be direct. Mona says unambiguous no, no mixed signals. Annie says, nah, no, not interested, go away. Yeah, those are all check extra to avoid confusion. Exactly. Yeah, those are all really good examples. Um, some other examples that came to mind, obviously, I'm sure there's more that I didn't think of. The most obvious one is if someone says no. If someone says no, absolutely do not proceed. But also, if they say maybe, or if they shake their head, or if in general they just don't seem super certain, like I'm sure we've all said yes to things, maybe not necessarily sexual things, but that we didn't really mean it and we didn't want to say yes, but we did. And that can happen in intimate interactions too. So it's just good to be really aware of people's body language and all their nonverbal communication as well. If they seem uncertain, it's probably a no and you should not proceed. If they're avoiding eye contact, if they're avoiding physical touch, if they're pushing you or anyone away, if they look sad, fearful, or they're crying, if they seem closed off, or their body language is stiff or tense, if they're just laying there and not moving at all, if they're silent, if they move your hands off of their body. Um, a lot of these things may seem super obvious to some people. However, assault and sexual assault, violations of these very clear expressions of not consent continue to happen in the world and also in activist communities. We are not exempt from these unacceptable behaviors. And people continue to overlook these signs of people not wanting to engage, either intentionally or unintentionally, and violate people's consent. Um, Again, it's just so important to always put other people's dignity and consent over our own sexual desires and pleasures, because our own pleasure is never ever an excuse for taking advantage of someone else, coercing them, or assaulting them. Um, and yeah, just a personal example, like not that long ago, uh, I was sleeping fast asleep in a bed, and I was really shocked to wake up to someone who I thought was my friend, who identified as vegan and a feminist, like the activist type, someone that I thought I could trust. And I woke up to them touching my body, and I was really shocked. And I wish I had been more forceful in the moment, but I was just so shocked. So I just moved their hands off of me and moved away. But they continued to do it like at least 3 or 4 times until I just had to get up and leave. Um, and I don't feel like my life was at risk necessarily, but I was pretty traumatized by it and it was pretty upsetting to me. And I cried a lot and I was really hurt just that someone that had been my friend for so many years would think that it's okay to do something like that. That just because they had felt horny in that moment, that they felt like it was okay to not treat me as a whole person and do or try to do whatever they wanted. Um, and I only mention that example because it's just, I think it just happens sometimes in this culture that people don't realize, even if they've sexually assaulted someone. Like, I don't know if that person realizes the weight and pain that they caused with that action, because they were just so selfish in that moment, ignoring my expressions of not consenting and my fear in that moment. So I'm just saying, like, no one is exempt from this. Like, anyone is capable of doing horrible things to people. And so that's why we're going over these really basic things. If someone takes your hand off of them, do not continue to touch them. So there's just an example. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call have similar examples. Um, and then also, I just want to say we have to be comfortable receiving no's. That goes for everybody. If someone says no to us, don't try to coerce them. Don't try to convince them, whether it's sexual or intimate or any other situation. It's just not appropriate to try to pressure people to change their mind when they're communicating that they're not okay with something, because it's just disrespecting their humanity, disrespecting their independence. And sometimes you might want to be intimate, or maybe you just want to hug someone. And if they say no to you, you just absolutely have to respect that. And don't ask them over and over again. That's another thing that happens pretty often that is pretty disappointing. I don't think people realize that it's definitely pressuring someone and it's not cool. And I think there's also an issue of people who are like socialized as men overestimating consent. So for example, if someone accepts help from someone, like if a woman accepts help from a man, and I hate to put genders on this because it can really happen to anybody, but or goes to someone's house, or accepts a drink, or sleeps over, etc. None of those cues mean that they're necessarily consenting to sexual activities, and that should just never be assumed. And if you're ever uncertain, just ask the person what they feel comfortable with, and what they want to do. Because I can think of so many times when I've helped somebody or accepted help from them, and it was clear to me afterwards that they expected something else, and you just can't make those assumptions about people because yeah, that's just dangerous and can lead to trauma and sexual assault. So it's just really important to always check that. Like if you aren't positive, don't assume, just ask. uh and I just want to provide a little context of what like a lot of people who look like women, have been raised as women, go through in terms of harassment and sexualization, and just why this is so frustrating and uncomfortable. And it's just because people on the street, particularly men, often ignore our discomfort and are shockingly comfortable making us uncomfortable. So, like, men catcall us and pull their cars up and stalk us and get out of their cars and try to touch us and hit on us. Like at least where I live, this happens every time I go outside. I don't even walk my dogs anymore. And it just, yeah, it's just not fair that so many of us have to deal with this harassment. And especially in the activist community is a place where we should all feel safe um, from this kind of sexualization and being viewed as an object like this. And yeah, and I just mentioned this because it's the reality in the culture that we have created by teaching people, especially people who are born as men, that their urges and sexual pleasures are more important than respecting other people's boundaries and humanity and consent. And some people may be thinking, well, I'm not a perpetrator and I don't catcall. Um, and I don't harass women, so none of this applies to me. But it really does because it applies to every single one of us. And these cultural norms affect all of us, and that's why all of us are here to unlearn it. So we've discussed a little bit about what consent does not look like. And there are also times when someone isn't capable of fully consenting at all. And so I wanted to invite everyone to answer in the chat. What are some factors that might impact someone's ability to consent to something? Were there times that you weren't able to consent to something? Can someone consent if they are drunk? And if you have had sex with someone, is it okay to touch their body while they're asleep? And people can answer in the chat. Leaf says altered mental status. Kathy says drugs, alcohol, grief, trauma, sleep, a lot of things. Dave says drunk or on drugs, mental capacity, lack of comprehension, a child or someone with a low IQ, says Mona. Orlando says a factor that may affect someone's ability to give consent is power dynamics, like a boss, emotionally vulnerable, language barriers. Yeah, I think y'all nailed it. Like those are a lot of the examples that I thought of too. Um, oops. Some things that could impact someone's ability to consent to something fully and with full understanding of what they're consenting to would be like language barriers, like Alona mentioned, or cultural barriers. People could have different understandings of different social cues, developmental disabilities, some mental health conditions, certain age or power differentials, impairment due to alcohol or certain drugs, if the person is unconscious or asleep. That said, obviously, people of different mental health conditions in different cultures, different ages can consent to having sex and being intimate. But what I'm saying is just these are factors that can impact their ability to do so, and they should always be taken into consideration. But people who are too drunk or asleep absolutely cannot consent. It's non negotiable. So again, consent is a clearly given yes, where each person is fully able and understanding of what is going on and willing to participate. When someone is incapable of giving consent, there's just no consent at all. And yeah, I wanted to talk about sexual assault and rape myths as well. So, while many of us come from different places and perspectives, we may have received a lot of similar messaging and lessons about sexual assault. So, we have an image of our mind maybe of what a perpetrator looks like and what a survivor looks like and who they are. But it's really important to keep in mind that any person of any identity group can experience sexual assault, and people of various identities can also perpetuate it. Um, So here's some just quick facts that national studies on college campuses have shown that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men will experience an actual or attempted sexual assault during their lifetime. From research, we know that most sexual violence against people of all genders is committed by men. However, most men are not rapists. Sexual violence happens most often to members of oppressed groups, so especially women of color, bisexual women, transgender women of color. And with all of this in mind, it is very likely that all of us know someone who has experienced sexual assault, if not ourselves. And no matter the survivor's gender identity, race, sexual orientation, class, or ability status, all survivors should be supported by the people that are around them. And often we think of sexual assault, we might imagine a stranger, a man that attacks a woman while she's walking home at night and they don't know each other, when in reality, the majority of sexual survivors are assaulted um, by someone that they know. So, like a date or a partner or even a coworker, someone they met at a party. Stranger rapes do happen, but they're just not the most common situation. And another common myth that is particularly offensive and discriminatory is the idea that poor men or men of color are the majority of perpetrators. And not only is that classist and racist, but it's also completely false. Usually, survivors and perpetrators are of the same race, so perpetrators can come from a variety of backgrounds, but men of color are not more likely than white men to commit sexual assault. And I also want to address the issue of false reporting. I don't know if y'all have ever heard someone say, oh, that person is lying about being raped or assaulted just um, to get back at somebody or because they regret it or to, I don't know, to get attention. And while it's really frightening to imagine being falsely accused of something that's so serious, research shows that only 2 to 8% of sexual assault reports made to the police are false, and the false reports are almost all made against unnamed strangers. So that makes false accusations even lower. And saying that victims lie about being raped or assaulted, or that people often falsely accuse anyone, pulls us away from the reality that in most cases, a person who says they were assaulted was indeed assaulted, and those accused are rarely falsely accused. And with all of that in mind, just a reminder that most people don't commit sexual assault. And regardless of what we've previously learned, it's on all of us to normalize consent, prevent sexual assault, and challenge these discriminatory misconceptions around who commits sexual assault and who the victims are. And yeah, now defining sexual assault, we've debunked a little bit of the myths around sexual assault, and I want to talk about what it actually is. So you can post in the chat, when you think of the term sexual assault, what comes to mind to you? And I'll give people some time. Violence is bodily harm, says Leaf. Grabbing at body parts, breaking consent. Yeah, I think those are all really touching someone sexually without consent, verbal assault. Yeah, those are all really on point examples. Sexual conduct without consent. Yeah, so sexual assault is just like y'all said, any inappropriate physical contact that includes non-consensual physical contact, so unwelcome sexual attention, sexualizing comments, jokes, unwelcome sexual advances, invasion of personal space, and any behavior that makes a community member sexually uncomfortable. In DXC, we define sexual assault as any sexual contact that does not involve the knowing consent of each person. And within that definition, we say knowing consent, which means that neither person is experiencing force, threat of force, deception, or pressure of any kind from the other person, and is fully aware of what they're consenting to. And sexual assault may or may not be penetrative, like it may not actually be someone having sex with someone or raping someone. It can be touching, it could be um sexualizing comments, grabbing somebody, forcing someone to do things to you. Um yeah, any sexual touching or fondling without consent is always sexual assault, as people have said in the chat. And yeah, in our code of conduct prohibits all the things listed here, from inappropriate physical contact to sexual attention to unwelcome sexual advances, repeatedly asking people out, all of those kinds of things. And then I just wanted to categorize a little bit of what sexual coercion looks like. So when we think about sexual assault, we often imagine like a violent struggle, or at least I used to. So someone yelling no and fighting back, and the other person physically forcing themselves upon them. But that's not always the case. And in fact, oftentimes sexual assault, it can be subtle, it can be silent. The victim may even be confused in the moment and not even know how to say no, or be fully aware of what is happening to be able to say no and speak up for themselves. So sexual assault may also involve obvious or subtle forms of coercion, and coercion is always anti-consensual and unacceptable. It's a form of like pressure to force somebody to do something. So on the screen, we have three different categories for coercion. There's physical coercion, threats of physical coercion, and emotional coercion. And I want to invite y'all to brainstorm a little bit and put in the chat maybe like one or two or three examples that you think of for each one. So when you think of physical coercion, what does that look like? And what is a threat of physical coercion? And what does emotional coercion look like? Brian says physically hurting them to perform an unwanted act, like grabbing their neck, pinning someone. Emotional coercion can be threatening to break up with someone. Physical coercion can be blocking a bedroom door. Emotional coercion can be, if you don't do XYZ, I'm going to break up with you. We are both vegans. We are so close. Sleep with me, says Annie. I think these are really good examples. So I had some other ones here, but people also came up with some really solid coercions or examples of coercion. Like Ali just said, guilting someone into doing something physical with them. Yeah, exactly. So physical coercion, I think, is the most obvious, like using a knife or some kind of object that could be used to hurt someone, like threatening them with it, using it on them to hurt them in some way, holding somebody down, spiking their drink with drugs is definitely physical coercion as well. Threats of physical coercion would be like, I'm gonna hurt you, blocking the exit, punching the wall, throwing an object. And then emotional coercion, which people had mentioned, is like threatening to disclose information about someone, like blackmailing them, badgering someone for sex, which is like asking them repeatedly, expecting sex as um, a gift in exchange for things, guilt tripping someone, shaming them, making them feel like they're a bad person, making them feel bad for not doing whatever it is that you want to do with them. And I see Carlos put emotional coercion is when you try to convince someone to do something they don't want to do. We need to be open, and you're too uptight if you say no. Emotional coercion can also be threatening to spread rumors about someone. Yeah, these are all really good examples. So I think that we can agree that none of these behaviors have a place in a healthy relationship, and each of these forms of coercion disrespects the other person's right to choose as an individual or to refuse to engage in a sexual activity. So, some other concrete examples, if someone says no or shows any sign that they're not interested or uncomfortable, do not try to convince them because, as mentioned, that is coercion. If someone asks you out or ask to have sex or anything, and for any reason you say no or you're uncomfortable, they have no right to repeatedly ask you or to beg you. Um, if you ask someone multiple times to have sex and they finally say yes, that's not really consensual because they had been pressured, possibly made to feel guilty, and were asked repeatedly. So even if ultimately they said yes, it's not really sincere. And if someone says no, don't take it personal because it's important that all of us are able to accept when people say no to us. And we should also do our best to make people feel comfortable being honest with us so that they never um, feel like they can't say no and they're able to say no when they need to. And sexual desire or personal pleasure, as I mentioned before, is never an excuse for harassing, badgering, touching, assaulting, or raping anybody. And now, and also another really important topic, I want to take some time to discuss the harmful responses to sexual assault. So, hopefully, we do our best to prevent sexual assault. But if and when it does happen, how we respond to it is also really, really important. Um, and there's ways to appropriately and not appropriately respond. So, one thing that can trigger or worsen the effects of sexual assault is when a survivor is blamed for what happened to them instead of the perpetrator. And this sounds like, oh my God, who would do that? Who would dare to blame a survivor and not the person that did the harm? Shockingly, incredibly common. And I don't know why, but like assault after assault that I see and situation after situation that comes out, I'm shocked to see how many people, even people that I like respected and loved, choosing the side of perpetrators. And I think it has to do with the world of the internet. People spread rumors and people get a lot of misinformation, but it happens, and even decent people can be misled and maybe don't think super critically about what they're doing and choose the side of the person who caused the harm rather than the person who came forward about the harm that was done to them, which is a very brave thing to do because they experience so much backlash. Victims do. So, people often say things to survivors or ask questions to them that make it feel like what happened to them was their fault, and that's called victim blaming. So, what are some common phrases or questions that exhibit victim blaming? And have you ever been blamed for your assault? Have you ever victim blamed either without realizing it? And people can share in the chat. Brian says she shouldn't have worn that outfit. Maya says, unfortunately, yes. I'm not sure what the yes is referring to, but also, I know for a fact that I've had victim blaming thoughts, especially when I was younger, because, and if anyone else has, like, it's okay if you don't want to post in the chat, but we grew up in a society that teaches us to view women this way or people this way, and we see it all around us. So, of course, that's what we're going to regurgitate, and repeat is what we've been taught. And we're taught to blame victims, and so that's what we're going to do naturally. And that's why it's so important that we stop and think on those thoughts, like, why am I thinking this, or why do I have these thoughts about this person, why am I asking them these questions, like, who taught you to think that way, Or Lena says, why didn't you say no? um Brian says, I victim blamed before. Dave says, you were being flirty. Alona says, you shouldn't have taken those drugs. He didn't act that way around me, said Carlos. Yeah, and sadly, these are all things that I've heard before, and I'm sure many people who have stepped forward with sexual assault trauma have heard, and it's really awful. And Ali says, trying to discredit or character assassinate the victim or survivor when they speak out against what happened to them. Exactly. And I think all of us hear these things and we're like, oh, that's horrible. I would never say those things or think those things. And I hope that's true because it happens a lot. And I hope that we can all be better than that and give victims and survivors the support that they need and the respect that they need instead of choosing the side of often more powerful people who get away with doing horrible things to other people. So here are some examples too of victim blaming. Some of these were already mentioned in the chat, but some questions um, that exhibit victim blaming are, why were you walking alone? What did you expect? Were you drunk? But they're such a nice person or such a great activist or whatever it may be. Um, they didn't mean it. Were you clear with them? Did you say no? Or why didn't you say no? Did you fight back? What were you wearing? But you've slept together before, etc. And people may ask these questions and say similar things without really thinking of what the message is behind those words. But these questions and statements make it seem like the assault that happened because of something that the survivor did or didn't do. And survivors already experience a lot of self blame and shame and guilt as a result of sexual assault. For anyone who has experienced it, I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. So it does not help at all to kind of be challenged or to feel blamed in addition. And all of this blame coming from other people can make it really hard for them to heal properly from what happened to them, to talk about it, to get the support that they need. And one very harmful behavior that I've seen happen to people is, as I mentioned, that they actually defend the perpetrator sometimes because they're such an amazing activist or because they've saved so many animals specific to our movement in our community. And you can do a lot of great things that make the world a better place. You can save animals, you can go to protests, but you're still capable of doing horrible things to other people and sexually assaulting them. And no matter how good of a person you may or may not be, you never have a right to violate someone's consent. And it's important to understand that even popular people or people that we really love and care about and respect are capable of doing bad things, including sexually assaulting people. And if someone you know or love is accused of sexual assault and you're having a hard time and struggling to believe that it's true, to believe that this person that you care about did something that's so bad, please take the time and the space that you need to process that and handle that, reflect on it. But do not create a hostile environment for the survivor. Do not publicly attack the survivor. Don't privately attack the survivor. If you have nothing supportive to say, don't even engage with them. Just don't say anything. I think that we should all support survivors, but if for whatever reason you don't feel that you can or you're not ready to support the survivor, just don't harass them or tell them that they're lying or any of those things that I mentioned. And I've seen this happen time and time again. And it's really disappointing and disturbing to see people shame and shut down people for coming forward doing such a brave thing that I wish I had been stronger to do all the times that assaults have happened to me. And I hope everyone feels strong to do, such as coming forward with abuse. And it's just shocking to see people shut them down and elevate and praise and like really dig their feet in to defend abusers. So don't be that person, please. Um, it's also really important to remember that blaming survivors for what someone else has done to them, and especially publicly shaming or attacking survivors or defending perpetrators, increases everyone's vulnerability, not just theirs, but everyone, because we're denying that sexual assault and rape can happen to anybody. And that certain people are capable of doing it to others, and we're allowing that behavior to continue, or worse, we're protecting it. And the fact that survivors are often blamed for what happens to them is one of the biggest reasons that people don't speak up. They don't come forward, they don't seek help, they don't report it. There's a survey that found that 52% of all violent victimizations are not reported to the police, and the vast, vast majority of sexual assaults are never reported. And that's at least in part because of victim blaming. I know that I've never come forward or posted publicly or even confronted the people who have sexually assaulted me. And maybe I should have or I shouldn't have, but part of the reason is I'm not, I don't think, brave enough, because I think the women and people who have come forward are so brave to be publicly attacked and shamed, possibly. I don't want to deal with that, you know? And that's not the world we want to create. We want to create a world where people feel safe coming forward and they feel supported. And we can address those issues directly. So, if someone comes if someone comes forward to you and shares that they've been sexually assaulted, or raped or abused in any way, what are things that you should do? What would you do? Does anyone want to share steps that they would take? Or if you have helped someone that came forward to you, what steps did you take? Um, and how have people supported you? If you have come forward, how were you supported? People can post that in the chat. Dave says, believe them first. Yeah, I think this tendency to like doubt, especially women that come forward about assault, and horrible things that happen to us, is just deeply rooted in patriarchy, that women are just disrespected, even though it's, I think, more often unconscious, but there's just like a deep respect for women, and I think that contributes a lot to women not being believed when they come forward. Alona says, ask them if they want medical care. Ali says, keep confidentiality and don't talk about other people's experience publicly or with others without their consent. That's such a good point, Ali. Absolutely. Ben says, validate them in their experience. Be an active listener. Ask them how you can help. All right. Yeah, and here, again, I posted the resources again here. But yeah, most important is to just believe the person. Um, and let them know that it's not their fault, regardless of what the person did or didn't do, or was wearing or wasn't wearing. No one ever has a right to force sex upon them or to use their body in any way, period. There's no situation in which that's okay. Let the person know that you are there for them and that you're listening and you're ready to help however they want you to help. Ask how you can help. And it can be really tempting sometimes to tell a survivor what to do or to make decisions for them. I know sometimes when people come to me for help, I just want to be like, okay, how about you do this and this and this? And it's so tempting to just problem solve for people. But I feel like, especially in sexual assault situations, since it's a crime of power and control, the most important thing is to find ways to give back that power and control to the person who is suffering. So, providing options is a really good way to help. Provide options for support or help or medical help if that's what they need. Offer to accompany them, but try to not take too much power out of their hands unless they have communicated that they need you to. And yeah, you can also accompany them when they do seek support. Again, there's the Bay Area Women Against Rape National Sexual Assault Hotline. If it's involving DXE activists and members that have done something horrible that need to be removed, you can always please inform the report team, which is report at dxc.io, because there should be, and reports can also be anonymous, but we can't be having that behavior ever in our community. And then most importantly, is just to respect the survivor's decision to get support and to choose the action that they want to take. And in society, ah, oh, sorry, shout it out. I forgot this part. Um, what were some of the steps? I just really want to like drill this in because I see time and time again people not uh, respecting these steps of supporting survivors at all. So, can people share real quick what again were the steps to supporting someone when they come forward with sexual assault? Almost forgot about this one. Empathize, ask how I can help. Yeah, I don't know if more people. Oh, and then Brian, be available for them if they need you to listen. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just to reiterate, believe them, let them know that it's not their fault, listen to them, like actively listen to them. Don't take all the power out of their hands. Give them as much control and power over the situation as possible. And do not victim blame them. It's just, it's so awful. And now people can share in the chat. A response to this question. So, in society, we really want to create a culture that normalizes consensual behaviors, dignity, and respect for all, especially in our activism, in our activist communities. And we must end sexual assault and harassment. So, what are some healthy consent culture practices that we can normalize in our communities? Like, what are things that we can do to make yeah, just respecting people's boundaries, respecting people's consent. How can we make that more normal in our community and also just in our lives and in our society and our everywhere? Open up the discussion. Yeah, I feel like people don't talk about this at all. Um, and I get that because it's like uncomfortable to talk about sex and stuff and assault, but it's so important that we just be open and talk about things. Dave says over communicate to make sure you have consent. Carlos always asks, is this okay? Brian says actively support survivors, call people in, talk about it, having resources for victims, increase explicitness of consent, ask for consent before more common activities like hugging, taking someone's time, asking for favors. Totally awesome examples. Yeah. So here's some more examples that I thought of. I'm sure some of you have thought of these ones too, but just asking for consent and stopping if you don't receive enthusiastic consent or aren't sure. Even ask if people want to hug or want to have a conversation with you. Sorry. Checking in during sex, ask if they're okay, if they like it, if they don't like it, if you can do other things together, etc. Being aware of people's body language, so any signs of discomfort that someone may express, being aware of power differentials, um, and other dynamics that can affect people's consent and ability to consent. Looking out for people who are under the influence of drugs and alcohol to make sure that their consent is not violated. I think that one's so important. Like we have to look out for each other. Having conversations with partners about what they like and don't like sexually. That's like the first thing that I ask my partners. It's just so important. Just like talk about it. Like what are you okay with? What are you not okay with? You know, talking to each other about respect and consent. And I think especially people who are socialized as men to talk to other people in that same group about these issues, calling out sexist jokes or harmful attitudes towards women, or if someone catcalls, to just call those things out. And it doesn't have to be like, oh wow, you're such a horrible person, but just to be like, hey, are you aware of like how that hurts people, what women go through, or what this group of people goes through, and how that contributes to rape culture and how prevalent sexual assault is, etc. Um, yeah, I just think that's so important to call those things out and call the people out in your community, um, or call them in rather. um, and kind of in the same vein, I've kind of looked at this as mostly a men's issue and not so much a women's issue. Of course, women are totally capable, anyone is capable of sexually assaulting. Um, but just because the vast majority of assault and rape that is happening is perpetrated by men, I'm obviously not saying that all men are rapists, but I just think it's something that men in their communities can um, have more influence and power over to kind of bring an end to. Similarly, I feel that like racism is more of a white people's issue because we're the ones that are benefiting and have largely created it, and we're the ones that need to address it. So similar with sexism and sexual assault, you know. Uh, and Okay, yeah, and that's my last slide. So we created this training and we started requiring it for DXC organizers, and we really want all our chapter members to take it too, because sexual assault has happened in our community, um, and it's really awful, and it's not something that you would expect from our community, but it happens. And that's why we also have a sexual assault policy, a code of conduct. We even have a relationship policy for all members of our community, in an effort to prevent any kind of sexual assault or harassment and to demonstrate how serious we take these issues. So, whoever joins the community, whatever they've been taught in their life, when they come into this community, we want them to see, like, okay, in this community, these behaviors, I need to like get it together and unlearn them and cannot treat people this way. Um, yeah, I'm on the report team, so we take sexual assault allegations really seriously. And if you experience or witness anything, please report it to us. And we've had to remove a lot of people from the community immediately due to sexual assault allegations. We don't play around with that at all. And it's just absurd to me to be an activist for animals, to join this community, to fight for animal liberation, but then to violate a fellow activist or any other human being's bodily autonomy. It's just absurd. And I really hope that we can create the best community possible where that doesn't happen at all. And I really appreciate all of you for your attention and your time and participation in this kind of introduction to consent, because I'm not a professional and consent is a huge topic. This is just barely scratching the surface. There's like so much more that you could discuss and learn. Um, the goal here is just to educate our community about consent and how to respond to reports of sexual assault. So it's by no means like the end of our life lesson and journey and learning about these topics, but just a starting point, just a baseline so that we can be on the same page when it comes to consent. And if you have any additional questions, you can totally reach out to me. And yeah, I just want to put it out there too. I did share a little bit of personal examples, but if anyone listening to this had like experiences come up for them of sexual assault, as many of us have had, please feel free to reach out to me if you need any support at all, or if you just want to talk about it or even vent about it. Don't hesitate. I would love to be there for you, because I just feel, in addition to educating one another, it's so important to support and be there for one another. So, yeah, let me just cut this.